My name is Jason. If I've not gotten the opportunity to connect with you, I'm the community outreach pastor here at Foundation. Before we jump into the text, Brooke just a little while ago shared a little bit about how we feel about Christmas around here. I'm probably like the office Grinch, I would say. But one of my favorite things about Christmas is the Ruth Hill Christmas Project. Several years ago, back when we started in 2017, we started our partnership with Ruth Hill Elementary School before we had an office, before we had anything. And so we've been at Ruth Hill for about 8 years. And one of the things that we did at the very beginning was to jump in and help kids that had a need for Christmas. And so we've continued that through one of our community partners at Bridging the Gap. They have a program called Christmas in Coweta that you guys will hear about over the next couple weeks with us. So one of the things that we do every year is we set up some ornaments outside for everybody to basically take care of a kid for Christmas. It's one of my favorite things that we do. It's very selfless. It's something that you can get your kids involved with doing. It's something that I enjoy so much. This year, I think the number is up over 170 kids that we'll have the opportunity to serve this year. Robin sent me some pictures, our kids director, yesterday of like when we started, and I think it was like 40 or 50 kids, which is crazy. We're probably going to push close to 200, which is going to be pretty awesome. So on the 17th, make sure, and I told the 9 o'clock this, and we're going to try to make it to where we save some ornaments for you guys. But the 9 o'clock, man, as soon as we started doing 2 gatherings, the 9 o'clock just like takes them all. So we're going to try, but if at all possible, we want to encourage you to come early if you want to support families at Ruth Hill and the siblings that are attached to those kids. We're going to jump into our 3rd week of the Everything is Political series. And as I was studying this week, and I think it was because I have a freshman in college now, which is ridiculous for me to think about, that I'm old enough to have a freshman in college. And this year is the first year that he can vote in an election. And so he's just like trying to figure it out. He's all researching it. He's like doing his civic duty or whatever that means. And so he's like all about this election. I don't know why, but he's just all about this election. He's like, and then I started thinking about, man, 24 years ago, I was in the same space. And then I was like, 24 years ago, like, man, I'm getting old. And then I had to go do something else so that I would, kind of reset. But Eli this week got the chance to vote, but it was crazy because I talked to him and he was like, all summer I was like, hey, you need to make sure you register your vote. You need to make sure you can vote down at your school where you're at. And he missed that like second part. So he had to drive back 2 hours just to go vote, which he did. But it made me think about that first election story for me. 24 years ago this week, I voted, like I said, in my first election. And it was so crazy because I think some states were still like using paper to do these elections. And other states, like there was no early voting. In Georgia, I don't think we had early voting. And so I remember like getting done with my classes that day. And I got to the polling place, which is like always an elementary school. I don't know why it's an elementary school, but it's always an elementary school. And so I got voted at elementary schools for like 24 years. And so I'm at this elementary school and I'm in the bus loading zone with like 3,000 of my closest friends in Henry County. And it's raining. And it's like, you got no protection from the weather. You just have nothing. If you brought a raincoat or an umbrella, you were good. I had neither, and it was like raining sideways, and the only thing I had was the bus loading zone awning to keep me like dry before I walked in. So I was in line forever. I don't know if you guys remember that election, but like I think everybody in America voted, and 40% of them were in line with me at the same time. And so I remember parking my truck in a parking spot that was not a parking spot because, again, it's at an elementary school that's built for 400 kids and 60 teachers, and that's all they have space for, and they bring everybody to the elementary school to vote. And so I parked my little Ford Ranger in a place that wasn't a parking spot in the rain. And so I go in line, I vote, get my little sticker, and I come out, and I realize that my truck is stuck. Like, literally stuck in the mud, and then all the big country boys from Henry County were like, all of their trucks were around my little tiny truck. And I had to wait on them to vote and to come outside, and then I begged them to help me get my truck out of the mud. Um, it was so embarrassing. And then it was like, why am I even here? What did I just do? Why was I so excited about doing this? I don't know if you guys have ever been there, but it's like going to watch a movie. It's like suspended reality, and then you come out and life is still happening. I thought that I was voting for something super important and that life was gonna be better when I walked out of the polling booth, and I'm stuck in the mud. Like literally stuck in the mud, and I can't do anything about it. And I think like we forget when we get into politically charged seasons like this, that literally no matter what happens on Tuesday or when all the other elections or all the votes come in from wherever they're counted and all of that craziness, like there's still life that happens. There's still life that happens. I remember after my mom passed away, and we we're just kind of stuck in the house, like she passed away, and we're at the cemetery, and we leave the cemetery, and there's people that are like still in line at the drive-through restaurants, right? There's people that are still parking their cars in the grocery store. And there's things that are happening, that life is still happening, but you're kind of like stuck, right? So in this section of Genesis that we're gonna look at today, we're gonna see a time period where Joseph could have chosen to stay stuck. But Joseph decided against that mentality. He decided, kind of coming off of last week and getting thrown into jail. If you were here with us, I'm going to recap all that in a second. But Joseph decided that he was going to be different. That no matter what happened to him, that life was still going to happen and he was going to do something with it. Now, to recap over the last couple of weeks, Clint, our lead pastor, began walking through the story of Joseph. We find the story of Joseph in the back third of the book of Genesis. And there's so much in his story. Like Joseph is the youngest and the favorite son of Jacob. Okay, he's the youngest and the favorite. He's the youngest of 12. And those 12 brothers hated him because he was the favorite. They hated him because he had this fancy robe that even if you are not a church person, even if you've not been here with us the last couple of weeks, you've probably heard of Joseph because of the coat that Jacob gave him. It's a cultural phenomenon. We've done shows, we've done Broadway shows about this coat. Okay, so everybody has a little bit of kind of handle over who he is and how he got this coat. Clint also shared with us a couple years ago that Joseph's, like I said, 11 brothers were enraged after the favoritism that was shown to Joseph. And so they cooked up this plan to get rid of Joseph. They didn't want Joseph around anymore. They were tired of him. They didn't want to deal with him. And so they came up with this plan to literally get rid of Joseph. And if it hadn't have been for the oldest brother, Reuben, the 11 would have killed Joseph. So Joseph is the great-grandson of Abraham, and that line would have been killed right then. They decided that they should sell him into slavery and then bring the colorful coat that was blood-soaked back to their dad and allow their dad to go through all of that grieving over his favorite kid. They thought that was the best plan. And so he was sold to the Ishmaelites into slavery, and then when they got to Egypt, he was sold to Egypt in slavery. Okay, so he had been killed by his brothers, sold into slavery twice, and then we see this massive political possible issue coming up. Clint challenged us with the political move and a spiritual move as a response to the political move in that first week. The political move is this: get rid of people you feel threatened by. That's what the brothers did. They got rid of Joseph, the 17, 18, 19-year-old kid that they felt threatened by. Got rid of him. But the spiritual move that week that we talked about was, you belong here. We, as a church, believe that everyone belongs. But in our culture today, and it's not something that was unique to Joseph's time, but in our culture today, And even then, most people just want to get rid of the people that threaten them. Whether it's somebody that you work with, somebody in your family, somebody that you want to ostracize or push out, this is something that's real, that our people and people today face consistently. Last week, Clint shared more of Joseph's story with us. Joseph ends up finding favor with a guy named Potiphar. Potiphar was a very important figure in the king of Egypt's team. And so Potiphar basically said, hey man, I trust you, you're responsible, you have risen up the ranks, so to speak, and you're in charge of everything I've got. You're in charge of running my household while I do my job. And so what happens? Potiphar's wife approaches Joseph several times consistently and tries to get him to sleep with her. Sorry, take a nap. Finally, she gets aggressive and flees with Joseph's coat. So everybody knew about the coat. They knew it was Joseph's coat. And so a story is cooked up, and Potiphar throws Joseph in jail. And he throws Joseph in jail while all of Pharaoh's prisoners are. So he's gone from wanted to be killed by his brothers, slavery twice, arrested without anybody hearing his story, and thrown into jail where the king throws all of his prisoners. The political move we talked about last week was to compromise your integrity to protect your own interest. The spiritual move that we talked about last week was to make integrity a priority always. And I remember Clint saying last week, you can't be halfway, you can't have half integrity. It's either you have integrity or you don't. It's either you have integrity or you're working on having integrity. There's no middle ground. And Joseph chose integrity. He refused the situation, honestly, guys, that most people would give into. He chose integrity because he prepared over years to take that path. And there are so few Josephs today in our culture. Our culture is riddled with leaders that have no integrity. It is riddled with leaders that have, it's all about leverage and all about what they want, right? It's all about what they want. And Joseph was a guy who desired to create an environment where everybody belonged, where everybody mattered. And we see that in the text that we're going to look at today. He lived in a world that was so much about leverage and getting where you wanted to go, and it didn't matter who you stepped over to get there. Kind of sounds familiar to where we're at this week. This is where we pick up the story that we're going to look at this morning. Genesis 39, we're going to start in verse 20. So remember, his brothers wanted to kill him. His brothers threw him into a deep cistern. They sold him into slavery. He was sold to Egypt in slavery, and then he was put in jail. So this is where we have this young guy, Joseph. Picking up in Genesis 39, verse 20. But while Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So we're going to stop there and just hang out there for a second. God's faithfulness with Joseph was incredible. He stuck with him. He gave him favor. Even though people did not see that Joseph was wrongly accused of all of these things, God was right there with him, faithfully remaining with Joseph. Even though Joseph was in prison, and what later Joseph, in his own words, describes as a dungeon. He was in prison for doing nothing wrong. He was in prison without his story being shared. He was stuck, but God was with him in that situation. Now, I don't know about you guys, and I don't have a story like Joseph's, but at my lowest, people have always showed up for me. And at my lowest, God has always been faithful by sending me people to show me and point me back to where I need to be. I remember several years ago in my college ministry days, it was just a really, really rough season. I can't go into all the specifics, but it was just a really, really, really low season. I felt like I'd been ignored, felt like I'd been, I wasn't thrown into jail, but I felt like I was kind of on an island, kind of by myself, just kind of existing. And I had everything so twisted in my head that ministry was about success, that ministry was about what everybody on the outside saw. And so I had a kid that was in my ministry. I say kid, he's about to get married next week, which is another thing I feel old about these days. But I remember him coming and sitting in my office after he'd been on a mission trip, and he's like, hey, he was kind of listening to me bellyache, and just kind of was really polite about it, let me go on for 30, 45 minutes. And so then he looked at me, he's like, hey, Jason, look, God is not concerned with your success. God is concerned about your faithfulness. And he said it that way. He said, Jason, you're called to be faithful, not successful. And so this is this tension that Joseph sits in, and I imagine in this dark, dreary, like ancient Egypt world prison, and that's where we have Joseph. But he's found favor with the warden because of what God had done for him. Verse 22. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. Okay, so this kid, while he was in slavery, okay, he became in charge in Potiphar's house. While he's in the dungeon, dreary, crazy Egyptian prison, he's risen to this spot of status because God's with him. The warden, listen to these words, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And guys, I don't think this warden was somebody that followed God. A warden in an Egyptian jail, he knew something was special with Joseph. And then we hit Genesis 40 that walks us through a scene in the jail and that Joseph was thrown into, and we see the responsibility and the effort that Joseph places into people that were not like him. And this is where we learn what we need to learn today. Some of this is going to be on the screen, some of it's not. We're reading through a chapter. I promise I'll go fast. We'll be out of here quick. Genesis chapter 40, starting in verse 1. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master. And we don't know how long from the text that it's been, but we know it's been some little bit of time anyway. We know that it's likely not immediately after he left Potiphar's house. Pharaoh was angry, verse 2. He was angry with his two officials, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. So we've already seen multiple times that Pharaoh was angry. And if we remember from Moses' story this summer, we don't want to make Pharaoh angry. And we put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the same prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard assigned them to Joseph, and Joseph attended them. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were held in prison, had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. When Joseph came to them the next morning, he saw that they were dejected. Okay, so time out. Joseph had all of the reason to be dejected, okay? This man was in jail after having been sold in slavery twice, after his brothers tried to kill him, and the Bible tells us that the other guys that had been with Pharaoh were dejected, okay? This is what happens in verse 7. Let's look at verse 7. It'll be on the screen. So he asked Pharaoh's officials who were in custody with him in his master's house, "Why do you look so sad today?" What? I'm not worried about why they look sad. I'm sad. I'm in a dungeon. I'm in here and nobody listened to my story. I've been sold in slavery twice, but that's what Joseph does. Continues that theme of integrity. He's been put in charge, so he's going to check on his people. He's going to check on his people. And he says, why do you look so sad today? And then both of them respond in verse 8. We both had dreams, they answered, but there is no one to interpret them. Then Joseph said to them, don't interpretations belong to God? Give me a crack at it. Tell me your dreams. Joseph, guys, did not deserve any of what he's received up to this point. But he's still focusing on helping and serving the people that were in his midst. There's something special in Joseph. There's something special in Joseph. It's the favor of God. Joseph was focused on these two other guys when he had all the reason in the world not to be. He could have easily been selfishly focused on his situation, but he chose to be focused on helping them in their time of need with the special gift that he was given by God. One scholar put it this way. I think this is really interesting. Those who faithfully use the abilities that God has given them, even in discouraging circumstances, demonstrate unwavering faith in God's promises to them. Verse 9, the cupbearer tells his dream. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream, and he said to them, in a dream, I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine there were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and the clusters ripened into grapes. Verse 11, Pharaoh's cup was in my hand. I took the grapes, squeezed the grapes into the cup, and put the cup in his hand. Verse 12, Joseph responds and says this is what it means. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were the cupbearer. Verse 14. When all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. Verse 15, I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. I'm going to sit in this for a second. In the Hebrew, which is the original language of the Old Testament, I'm going to be a nerd real quick. The original language of the Old Testament, we don't really have clarity on what's happening here, but this could be like a rhetorical thing where he's like, hey, cupbearer guy, please remember me when can you throw in a good word for me, right? Because we don't have an answer from the cupbearer, okay? But we also see it's kind of can be translated as like a plea or a request. It's like, hey man, because of this dream and the way that I interpreted that, and God gave me those skills to interpret that dream, there's gonna be some good things that happen for you. And so when you're on your way back up to the top, can you remember the little guy that's in the dungeon? That's kind of what we have there. Verse 16, when the chief baker saw that Joseph had a favorable interpretation for the other guy, he's like, hey, I'm gonna tell you a dream, and this is his dream. He said, I too had a dream. On my head, there were 3 baskets of bread. That's odd. I can kind of understand the other one, but in 17, it says, in the top basket were all kind of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat your flesh. That's what it says. Now, on the 3rd day, it was Pharaoh's birthday, which explains some of it. And he gave a feast for all of his officials. He had lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of all the officials, all the important people. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Verse 23. The chief cupbearer, verse 22. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. Verse 23, The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. And then we get that double down piece that he forgot about him. I'd like to argue that this part of the narrative is more about what Joseph did not do than what he did do. When Joseph got thrown in prison, he didn't pout. He didn't withdraw. He didn't make sure that the cupbearer and the baker failed. He didn't not interpret their dreams. He also didn't lie when he could have lied about their dreams. And he didn't leverage anything that was happening for those guys for his good. He stayed true to who we've seen him to be. He asked to be remembered, but he left it up to somebody else to do the remembering. So what is there for us to learn in this? You know, the last couple of weeks, Clint's used the phrase, this isn't about DC. It's about you and me. And you know, over and over again, both in the ancient world and in our world and every time in between, people are always looking for a way for other people to fail. I can't tell you how many times I've talked with people that are a part of our church, and part of that story is other people wanting them to fail. Friends, family members, acquaintances, business partners, you name it. And that's what the divisive world that we live in has become. It's all about leverage. It's all about getting ahead. It's all about you do something for me, I'll do something for you. And that's like the opposite of where Joseph's at. It's the opposite. And honestly, yeah, we see that all the time in politics. Like every other text message that I've gotten in the last 6 weeks has been about all of this. Every commercial, everything, it's divisive. It's about leverage. It's about painting the other person as the worst person ever, which is exactly the opposite of the story of Joseph. The political move is simple. When things don't go my way, I will go out of my way to make sure other people fail. I will withdraw. I will complain. I will do everything in my power to make sure other people fail. The spiritual move. Even when things don't go my way, everyone will receive my best. Those are so different. Those are so different. You know, even when other people's decisions bring you stress and difficulty, serve them anyway. There's so many moments this week, I can't even tell you, that other people's decisions were impacting what I was just trying to get done in a day. But I had the decision, and I knew where we were headed this weekend, but I had the decision of, I'm just going to let them fail, or I'm going to serve them anyway. That's what Joseph did. That's what Joseph did. And the crazy part about it is, guys, we are most like Jesus when we are serving other people with no agenda. And there's lots of agendas. Everybody has one. But we are most like Jesus. We are most like Joseph. We are most like the people that we need to be like when we are loving people and serving people with no agenda. And I know you're probably like, yeah, Jason, that's your job to say that. Which technically is, because I'm supposed to help you guys get connected and serve in the community and all of those things. So yes, it's my job, but that's how we need to live. And that's the frustrating thing for me, because it is my job. But it's also a huge, huge blessing to see the light bulb go off. And kids and adults, it's all the same. But we want to be a church, and we will continue to be a church that serves no matter what. I know you're thinking, yeah, I get it. It's your job. But how does this apply on Tuesday? How does this apply on Tuesday when the polling locations close and your truck is stuck in the mud? That's probably not going to happen, because a lot of people voted early in places that have big parking lots and all of that. But how does that apply Tuesday? How does that apply Wednesday? How does it apply when the election results are in and those stupid commercials are off your television? How does it apply? Because we can't just leave it here in this room. It has to apply. You know, I looked a good bit at projections of the election this week as to how the election might pan out. And for those of you that know math, or like know somebody that's like a math nerd, all these polls, like even up to Friday and Saturday even, like all of these polls were inside the standard deviation of the poll. That's how close this thing might be. Like, or it may not be that close, nobody knows, but they think they do because they call themselves experts and they know math, right? We don't know how this is gonna happen, but we do know that roughly 50% of our country is gonna be on the losing side. 50%-ish, close to that. And 50% therefore is on whatever the winning side, right? So how do we treat each other? How do we treat each other in the middle of that? How do we treat each other as a church, as friends, as community members in the middle of that? It's this spiritual move. Even when things don't go my way, everyone will still receive my best. That's tough. It's easy when things are going your way to give everybody your best, but it's a whole nother deal when things aren't going your way. When things in life that are way more important than red states and blue states aren't going your way. It's really tough. It is close to impossible. And it takes every bit of you and every bit of Jesus to serve other people. That's what I'm talking about. How are we going to respond? How should we respond? How will each half respond to the results? How will how will those that don't vote go, why does this matter? So how do we deal with those people? The answer is we serve them anyway. Like the cupbearer and the baker in jail that had a dream that needed to get interpreted. And they got back to the big house before Joseph did. And Joseph was forgotten, but he still continued to serve. And we know that because of what we're going to dig into next week. How do we respond? Andy Stanley wrote a book a couple years ago. And in the book, he had a quote that I thought was pretty cool. He said, "How should Jesus following Republicans and Democrats treat, speak about, and respond to one another, publicly and privately? The way Jesus treated, spoke to, and responded to those people that disagreed with him." So if you want to know how to respond, follow Jesus. If you want to know how to respond, pay attention to what we talked about with Joseph this morning. You know, I think we have to remember that Joseph was first about honoring God with everything that he was, but then he was like right up to being important like that. He was about serving the people to the same level that he honored God. That's hard to do. And that was 100% difficult in the political climate that he lived in. And it's just as hard in our day too. As I studied this week, two sets of verses came to my mind, and I want you to track with me for a second. This is several hundred years after the story of Joseph. There's a guy named Paul who was a church planter. And Paul was writing to a church that he was pretty frustrated with, that he had planted, that was kind of getting sideways a little bit. And at the end of this letter, he shares two chunks of scripture that are two thoughts that I think are really huge for us that we can live in over the course of this week. Galatians 6, 2 and 3. Carry each other's burdens, and in this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Verse 3. If anyone thinks that they are something when they are not, they deceive themselves. Let's skip down to verse 9. This is the part that hits me hard. And it might just be me, but I don't think it is. Let us not become weary in doing good. For at the proper time, we will reap a harvest if we never give up. Therefore, verse 10, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people. All people, especially to those who belong to the family of believers. How are we going to show people that we love them? How are we going to try to serve our community if we let something as silly, I say silly, I don't mean to trivialize it, but as not as important, like an election, break apart what we have going on here and in our community? Man, yeah, we are going to disagree. That's people. I can't even agree with myself sometimes. But we are to love all people, and it has to start here, in these seats, in our homes. It has to start here. Everything is political, but there are some things that matter way more than politics. Whether or not your candidate wins or loses on Tuesday, how we treat people still matters more. And you cannot convince me otherwise. Can we carry one another's burdens? Can we serve the way that Joseph served? Can we not grow weary in doing good? Can we set an example for how we serve other people? Both inside this family and people that are close to us but far from God. Can we do that? And guys, Joseph understood it. As a young kid in a dungeon-like jail, he got it. So I want you to think about Joseph this week as things might get sideways on social media, because it's coming. Don't jump into it. Even though you want to jump into it, there's a couple times this week with different posts that aren't even about this that I'm like, just threw my phone away for a minute. Serve anyway. Because I guarantee you that it doesn't matter who wins on Tuesday. Jesus matters more.